Anastasia, The Ringing Cedars Series, Book 8, Part 2, Rites of Love, by Vladimir Migre, translated from the Russian by John Wordsworth, edited by Leonid Shurashkin. Chapter 1, Love, the Essence of the Cosmos. All of a sudden, a figure appeared on the roadway ahead. He was standing practically smack dab in the middle of the travel lane, with his back to my oncoming jeep. I began braking at once so as to carefully go around this strange-looking gray-headed figure. When I got within 10 meters of him, the old fellow quietly turned around, and I instinctively pressed the brake pedal to the floor. There, in front of me on the roadway, stood none other than Anastasia's grandfather. I recognized him at once. His gray hair and beard were a complete contradiction to his incredibly young, sparkling eyes, a discrepancy which immediately set him apart from many of his peers. And the long gray raincoat of indeterminate cut from goodness knows what material was also something I was able to recognize all too easily. Still, I had a hard time believing my eyes. After all, how could this oldster from the Siberian taiga turn up here in the heart of Russia, on a roadway leading from Vladimir to the city of Sudzal? How, indeed? By coach and horse? How could the Siberian recluse hope to master all the intricacies of our transportation networks? Add to that a complete absence of any kind of identification documents. Money, of course, he could have laid his hands on by selling dried mushrooms and cedar nuts, as his granddaughter Anastasia had done, but with no identification? Of course, we have lots of homeless people without identification, and the police can't do anything about it. But Anastasia's grandfather is far from resembling your average homeless person. Sure, he was dressed in old shabby clothes, but they were always clean, and his appearance was well groomed. His face was bright, and a light blush adorned his cheeks. I sat there, unable to move, behind the wheel of the jeep. He came over, and I opened the half door for him. "Hi there, Vladimir," the old fellow greeted me as though there were nothing unusual about the circumstances. "You heading to Suzdal? Can you give me a lift?" "Yes, of course I can. Hop in. How did you end up here? How on earth did you manage to get here all the way from the taiga?" How I got here isn't important. The main thing is why I came. Well, why did you come? To take a tour into real Russian history with you, and to dispel your resentment toward me. My daughter Anastasia told me to. She said to me, "Grandpakins, you are to blame for his resentment." So here I am, joining you on the tour. That's why you're going to Sudzal, isn't it? Yes, I want to go see the museum. And I really did feel resentment, only it's gone now. We rode some time in silence. I recalled how frosty our parting had been back in the taiga. In fact, we didn't even say goodbye. It had happened like this. Anastasia's grandfather had recommended I set up a political party. He suggested calling it the Motherland Party. The idea of forming a party based on Anastasia's ideas had actually been noised about for some time by various people. Many believed a political party was essential to make it easier for people to acquire land for the building of family domains, and head off any kind of encroachment on the part of the government officials, since none of the existing parties, regrettably, had even considered such questions in their platform. In view of the fact that there are some sort of powers opposed to Anastasia's ideas, and that all sorts of attempts have been made to discredit not only the ideas themselves, but also people who have been attracted by them, as well as Anastasia with me, it was suggested to draft the party's constitution without any reference in its aims and objectives section to creating favorable conditions for the setting up of kin's domains. Nor should there be any mention of Anastasia's ideas or the Ringing Cedars series. The would-be organizers were trying to persuade me that this would be the only way to get the party officially registered. And so I decided to consult with Anastasia's grandfather on this question, as well as on the topic of the party's structure, its primary aims and objectives. I surmised that since he was well acquainted with the acts of the priests who were constantly setting up all sorts of societal structures and religions which had lasted millennia, he must surely know about the secret organizational tenets underlying such longevity. Besides, he himself was a priest of some standing, quite possibly even stronger than the ones currently ruling the world. If so, then he must certainly be aware of the principles underlying the priesthood itself, which had turned out to be more resilient than religion. Indeed, the priesthood was and is a super-religious structure, since the priests took direct part in the creation of certain religions and secular institutions. This is clear from the history of ancient Egypt and other countries. It followed that Anastasia's grandfather would be able to set forth certain fundamentals for the Motherland Party, making it a most powerful, if not the most powerful institution. I sincerely wanted to hear what he had to say on this, and so I took advantage of what I thought was a moment, when he was not immersed in his inner contemplations, and said, "You were speaking about a party. My readers, too, have been talking about this for some time. But some of them are recommending that I don't include any mention of its constitution of Anastasia or her ideas or the books, so that the registration will go smoothly." The gray-haired old fellow stood before me, leaning on his father's staff without saying a word. It wasn't just that he kept his silence, he stared at me fixedly, as though seeing me for the first time. His eyes reflected more criticism than kindness. And when he did start speaking again after a lengthy pause, his voice too betrayed notes of disdain. "Registration, you say? So you've come to ask my advice, to betray or not to betray. What's this about betrayal? I came to consult with you on how to proceed so that the registration will go smoothly." Registration, after all, is not an end in itself, Vladimir. Even the party is not an end in itself. No ideas, you say? Not even a mention? So, how are readers going to realize that it's their Motherland Party, and not just some mercantile trader's party? You've been asked to set up some kind of meaningless organization, without any basis, ideas, or symbols which would already guarantee leadership for centuries to come. And now you've come to ask me whether you shouldn't follow their advice? Don't tell me you couldn't see through even this simple trick. I realized I had got myself into a rather sticky situation, and so I tried to get out of it by asking another question. I only wanted to see if there were some principles you could recommend including in the draft of the party's constitution, its aims and objectives. What happened next nearly drove me out of my mind. As it seemed to me back then, the old fellow was not only refusing to answer my questions, he had started making fun of me in a high-handed way. First he looked at me wide-eyed, then he gave me a kind of irritated chuckle and turned away, even taking a step back from me. But then he turned around again and said, "Don't you understand, Vladimir? All the answers to the questions you raise should be given birth within yourself, and within everyone who joins you in creating the party structure. Sure, I can give you a hint, but tomorrow someone else will give you another hint, and then a third, and you won't act. All you'll do is focus your attention on the hints. Go right, go left. You'll all go forward and then backward again, or keep going round in circles because of the laziness of your minds." I strongly resented this latter phrase. Over the years since my first meeting with Anastasia, I've been stretching my mind to the limit day and night. Maybe it's starting to overheat from the constant stress of the work. I've published 8 books now, and have often taken to contemplating what is written in them myself. Sometimes I've found myself pondering the accuracy of particular phrases time and again. And surely the old fellow must know about all this. Even though my resentment was starting to become inflamed, I managed to restrain myself, explaining, Indeed, it seems as though everybody thinks and reflects, and various political systems are set up, communist, democratic, centrist. But as someone once said, no matter what party we aim to create, it all ends up looking like the Communist Party's Central Committee. That's very true. That's what I've been telling you. You're going round in circles because of the laziness of your minds. What's laziness of mind got to do with it? Maybe it's simply that not enough information is available. So there's not enough information out there, and you've come to me to get it, eh? But if your mind is lazy, will you be able to make any sense of it? I could feel my resentment increasing, but I endeavored to conceal my irritation and continued. Okay, I'll try to make my brain work harder. Then pay attention. The party should be structured along the lines of the Novgorodviche. I mean, in its early period. You'll figure out the rest later. This answer made me really angry. The oldster knew perfectly well that documents on pre-Christian Russia were nowhere to be found. They had all been destroyed, so nobody could ever tell how this Novgorodviche worked, especially in its early period. That meant he was mocking me. But why? What had I done to make him... Trying to restrain myself out of respect for his age, I apologized. Excuse me for disturbing you. You are probably occupied in something important. I'll leave you. And I turned around to go, but he called after me. But the aim or objective of the Motherland Party should be the creation of favorable conditions for the restoration of the energy of love to families. It is essential to bring back the rites and celebrations which can help find one's other half, one's soulmate. What? I turned to face the old fellow again. Love? Bring it back to families? I realize you don't want to talk serious with me, but why are you making fun of me? I'm not making fun of you, Vladimir. It is you who are not capable of understanding what it's all about. If you don't train yourself to contemplate, it can take years to figure out. Figure out what? You have at least a rough idea of what kinds of aims and objective parties all over the world write into their constitutions? I have a rough idea. Then tell me. If you know that, tell me. They claim they will definitely raise the standard of living for everyone and will offer the people greater freedom. Exactly. And in particular, they promise industrial development, guarantee housing, and control over inflation. Nonsense, utter nonsense, the oldster chortled. Nonsense? Yes, it will be nonsense if I follow your advice and put in as a basic tenet of the party's constitution. The party will work toward the goal of helping every individual find their soulmate. And you can add, the party will restore to the people a way of life and rights capable of preserving love in families forever. What on earth are you talking about? You want to make a laughingstock of me in front of everybody. Questions like this, like searching for one's soulmate, this is what marriage agencies do on a commercial basis. If I include statements like that in the party's platform, it will end up being not a party, but a dating service. And as for love and families, well, that's a personal matter for families. And no political party has the right to interfere in family affairs. That's none of the state's business. But don't tell me your state isn't made up of families. Aren't families the basis of any state? They are. That's why the state is obliged to raise the standard of living both for families and for individual citizens. And then what? The old fellow snapped. By raising the standard of living in the country, will you then restore love to a great many families? I don't know, but it is accepted that states should care about the welfare of their citizens. Vladimir, ponder for a moment what the word welfare means. Calm down and delve into its meaning. Now I'm going to say it just a little differently. well-faring or faring well. That is, a state of well-being. If you think about it, you'll realize that love alone is capable of raising any man's well-being to the highest possible level. Not money or palaces, but only the feeling given to man by the Creator, the state of love. Love is the essence of the cosmos, living, thinking, with an advanced intellect. It is powerful, and it's no wonder God was excited about it, giving its great energy as a gift to man. It is imperative to try to understand love and not be shy about paying attention to it even on the national level. And when the nation is comprised of a multitude of families giving birth to their children in love and creating a space of love, it will not suffer from lawlessness or inflation. Such a nation will have no need to fight against criminal tendencies. They will disappear from society, and all the prophets with their cunning philosophizing will be silenced. Whether they foolishly neglected to mention it, or whether it was simply beyond their comprehension, is unimportant. But they led people away from the most important thing to a place where there is no love. The priests knew about this, and consequently humored the prophets. For centuries, mankind had been creating rites in aid of life and love. Whether these rites were suggested by the Creator or the people's own wisdom had perfected them is unimportant. They, in fact, over the centuries, created a state of well-being and helped young people obtain love and joy in perpetuity. None of these rites was characterized by occult superstition as today. Each one served as a school of higher learning, an examination by the universe. Anastasia told you about the Vedras wedding rite that dates back centuries. You mentioned it in one of your books, but it deserves to be mentioned in every book. It is far from being fully comprehended by people living today, including you. If you remember, she also told you about ancient ways of searching for your one to love. But again, you today have not been able to make sense of them. My granddaughter said, I, apparently, have not created strong enough images. She takes all the blame upon herself, but I claim that the laziness of your mind, or minds, is also to blame. Let the best learned men study the Vedras wedding rite, letter by letter. They won't, and you'd better believe me, Vladimir, they won't find a single occult or superstitious act. It is an act which is both rational and exactly suited to love's creation. Compared to it, you will see how absurd are today's wedding celebrations. Traditions smacking of occultism and superstition. You must realize that Anastasia knows immeasurably more than she tells you. Her acts, her logic, her behavior are not immediately understood even by the priests, who subsequently can only marvel at what my granddaughter has done. Inquire of her and inspire her with your question. Ask her what right the Vedras people had for childbirth. Don't count on her to bring the subject up. She takes care to talk to you only about what she thinks interests you, but you don't have the slightest idea of what tremendous hidden wisdom lies in the ancient rites. They are the creation of the cosmic worlds. Any world that forgets the wisdom of its age-old forebears deserves derision. It makes no difference whether an individual has forgotten on his own or under the influence of the priests who have mastered the occult sciences. Inquire of my granddaughter and inspire her with your question, and summon your party to the creation of love. Until that happens, you are of little interest to me. You need to have the most obvious things explained to you at length. Show forgiveness to an old man. Go. I do not find it useful to talk and think of unpleasantries. The old fellow turned and started slowly walking away. I stood there all alone in the taiga, feeling I had been spat upon. The resentment I had felt right from the start of our conversation prevented me from making sense of everything he said, but subsequently, upon returning home, I mentally went back to our conversation in the taiga, pondering it and analyzing it. I very much wanted to prove, perhaps not so much to Anastasia's grandfather as to myself, that I had not become completely lazy of mind. I wanted to either disprove or confirm what he said within myself. Back in the taiga, the oldster had told me that as long as people are content merely to listen to hints and not begin to think about the essence of life for themselves, society will never be free from its cycle of social upheavals, and man will never be happy. I guess that's the way it is. He also talked about the existence of some kind of program created by God. Now, what might that be? To what extent does the life of man today correspond with this program? Chapter 2. Do our lives correspond to the divine program? A man was born in the operating room on the second floor of a hospital. The doctors were surprised to see an absolutely healthy baby. Days and months flew by like seconds. The child attended kindergarten, then school, then university. Wise educators, teachers, and professors instilled in him some kind of program of life. The man decided that the most important thing in life was to have lots of money, which would enable him to feed himself well, have an apartment, a car, and clothing. And he began to work hard, sometimes even taking 2 shifts a day. Still, the seconds dragged out into years, and when he reached retirement, he had been able to earn enough for a modest 2-room flat and a used car. Long before retiring, he fell in love, got married, divorced, and remarried. His first wife bore him a child, but after the divorce, the child stayed with his mother. A child was born from the second marriage, but he went off to the far north. They talked on the telephone once or twice a year. Seconds counted down the years of the man's old age. He took ill and died. Such is the sad fate of the majority of people living on the earth today. There is a minority who manage to become famous entertainers, politicians, presidents, or millionaires. Life for this category of people is considered to be more happy, but that is an illusion. Their cares are no fewer than anyone else's, and their end turns out exactly the same: old age, disease, and death. Was such a fate included in the divine program for residents of the earth? No. The Creator could not predestine such a sad and cruel fate for his children. It was human society itself, under the influence of some kind of powers, that ignored the divine program and started down a path of self-torture and self-destruction. Perhaps somebody doubts the existence of the divine program of human life. After all, it is not something our scholars or politicians talk about. Religions propound God's design, but invariably through intermediaries, and mostly in different ways. About the only thing they agree on is that God exists. Philosophers and many scholars, too, believe in the existence of a higher, rational, intelligent being that has created the visible world and earthly life. It is impossible not to believe this. Everything comprising our world, after all, is too logically interconnected for it to be otherwise. Well, if that is the case, then a supremely rational being could create only in a meaningful way. Create only that which is eternal and predestine a joyful perspective for all living beings. First and foremost, his beloved man, made in his likeness. Man, in other words, is offered a specific way of life on the earth which allows him to become aware of himself and all creation, to learn about and continue to carry out the divine program, contributing his own marvelous creations thereto. God desires from his Son, man, conjoint creation, and joy for all from its contemplation. There is no doubt that God's program exists, and it is not just a select group that can become acquainted with this program, but everyone who wishes to do so. The divine program is not set forth in letters or hieroglyphics on sheets of papyrus, but in living signs of nature, nature as God has created it, and which belongs only to Him. The minds and intellects of the people of the ancient Russian period still allowed them to read the grand book of the divine. Out of the billions of such letter signs, the majority of people living today are acquainted with but a few, and we must begin anew to study the divine alphabet. The book I am writing at the moment is not on a religious theme. It is not an attempt at sheer philosophizing. This book is a call to research, to becoming aware of the divine program. I am not about to teach anyone or preach anything. I only want to acquaint my readers with the information on the culture of our forebears, through the rites perfected by the wise men, through careful calculation and designed to preserve family love, and to call upon everyone to disprove or confirm the arguments presented. I was prompted to publish this material by the sayings and logical conclusions of the Siberian recluses, especially Anastasia. Publication is needed in order to let the information seep through to the level of one's own feelings, and through collaborative efforts to start to act according to the logic of life, as well as in the hope that our generation will begin to contemplate and then accelerate the building of a new civilization for themselves and their children. It is possible that Anastasia has conceptually outlined just the first point in the program of mankind's development, to wit, human society should study the divine program, using the materials God has provided, and transforming the whole natural planet into a marvelous paradise oasis, thereby creating a harmoniously balanced society for all living beings. Man's attainment of this level of life will open up possibilities for the creation of life on other planets and in other galaxies. Against the background of this grand concept, Anastasia first proposed the creation of family domains. Let us too begin our research by examining commonly known and outwardly simple issues. Chapter 3. Why does love come and go? Oh, how many poems and philosophical treatises have been devoted to this very feeling. In fact, it is hard to find a literary work where it is not touched upon to some extent. Nearly all religions talk about love. It is considered to be a great feeling imparted to man by God. The reality of our current human conditions, however, portrays the feeling of love as a most sadistic phenomenon. Let's face the truth. Statistics show that 60 to 70% of marriages are doomed to failure. The failure comes after years of an uneasy coexistence on the part of two people who were once in love. Sometimes these years are marked by mutual insults, scandals, and even face smashing. The original beautiful and inspired feeling vanishes, only to be replaced by years of anger, insults, hatred, and, ultimately, unhappy children. This is the sad result of what we call love today. Could such a result be considered a gift from God? No way. But perhaps it is we ourselves who turn aside from some kind of way of life inherent in man, and that is why love is vanishing, telling us, in effect, I can't live in such conditions. Your way of life is killing me, and you yourselves are dying. Remembering my conversation in the taiga, I recalled how unusually the gray-haired recluse talked about love. Love, he said, is the greatest and most powerful energy in the cosmos. It is never thoughtless. It has thoughts and its own feelings too. Love is a living, self-sufficient entity, a living being. By the will of God, it is sent to earth, ready to bestow its great energy on every earth dweller and make their lives eternal in love. It comes to each one of them, endeavoring to tell them, through the language of feelings, about the divine program. If man doesn't listen, it is forced to leave, not by its own will, but by man's. Love, a mysterious feeling, and even though almost every man who has ever lived on the earth has managed to experience it, love remains largely uninvestigated. On the one hand, the theme of love is touched upon in most works of prose and poetry, and in most artistic genres. On the other hand, all the information these contain merely establishes the existence of such a phenomenon. At best, it describes but the outward manifestations of love and variations in behavior on the part of different people under the influence of the feeling as it has appeared in them. But is it necessary to investigate the feeling of love which everybody knows? The extraordinary and brand new information I received in the Siberian taiga confirms that investigation is extremely necessary. We need to learn to understand love. I believe one of the most accurate answers to the question as to why love fades is simply that it vanishes when it finds no understanding. People in the past understood love. Judge for yourself. More than 10,000 years ago, the Vedras people possessed knowledge enabling them to carry out actions which not only strengthened love, but made it everlasting. One such action was the ancient Vedic wedding rite. After the description was published in one of my books, many academic researchers came around to affirming that this particular rite was capable of transforming an initially flaring feeling into a permanent one. Comparing it with the rites of various peoples, both past and present, I began more and more to draw the conclusion that the ancient Vedic wedding rite was a rational deed, thought up by the wisdom of the people, which capable even today of helping many family couples find lasting love. However, let's go through everything in order, and let us begin with the most important thing. Should we seek out our other half? My other half, my soulmate? It's a popular expression. Let's see what it means exactly. I think many people will accept the following definition. A man or woman close to you in spirit and their views on life, a pleasant communicator, someone you feel attracted to, including their appearance, someone capable of inspiring you to love. Should we seek out our soulmate or let our other half be found all on its own through the will of destiny? As many centuries of mankind's experience has shown, a determined search is essential. This is attested in multitudes of stories in which stout-hearted young men have set off on long quests in search of their intended. There are a number of ancient rites which can aid the most important search of one's life. There are ancient rites, too, which can help determine whether one has made the right choice. What if that other half has come to you straight from the devil himself? Some of these rites I have already described in my previous books. I did not touch upon well-known rituals, but mostly introduce rites that are not commonly known and have not been encountered heretofore. The present book focuses on the wedding rite, and, at the same time, the rite for the determining whether one has made the right choice of partner, which I shall go over again in a different context. Then get on with it. Show us these miraculous rites, some of my readers may be thinking. Why bother with all these expositions? But the expositions are absolutely essential. We need a vision of our reality today, otherwise we shall not understand the tremendous signification of the wisdom of the people. Everything in the world is relative, and hence comparisons are crucial. So let's now take a look and see which life situations in today's world can facilitate a meeting, and which may just get in the way. Strange as it may seem, in our present so-called information age, situations favoring a meeting of two halves are getting harder and harder to find. People living in large, densely populated megacities are virtually cut off from each other by invisible barriers. Someone living in a modern, multi-storied apartment block is often unacquainted with his next-door neighbor. Passengers on public transport, even those standing jam-packed shoulder to shoulder in the aisles, are all absorbed in their own individual problems. Pedestrians walking along the same street have no reason to communicate with each other. And in America, for example, you can't even look closely at a woman without being suspected of sexual harassment. And so, just sitting in your flat or traveling to work or studies, there's practically no opportunity to find your soulmate. Let's say your work involves contact with a lot of different people. Let's say you're sitting at a cash register in a large supermarket. But none of the customers passing by you every day thinks of striking up an acquaintance with you. It's more likely they see you as merely an adjunct to the cash register. A college or university where a whole lot of young people congregate. Though it indeed offers opportunities for conversation and coupling, it is not a place for general selection of one's soulmate, since an educational institution is designed with a completely different function in mind. Today, the most acceptable locales for meeting people are generally bars, restaurants, discotheques, and resorts. But encounters here, even those which end in marriages, do not, as a rule, result in a happy life in love and harmony. According to statistics, 90% of such marriages end in divorce. The principal cause lies in a false image. And what might that be? Well, here's an example. False images. Back before I met Anastasia, I took a 2-week cruise on the Mediterranean Sea. Each day in the ship's dining room, my mealtime companions were 3 young people, 2 women and a man, who worked in a design institute in Novosibirsk. Each day the girls appeared in new and stylish clothing with intriguing hairdos. It was a delight to chat with them. Nadia and Valia, as they were called, were always cheerful and outreaching. One time I found their male companion in his cabin, and I asked him, "What pretty and pleasant girls we have at our table. Maybe we can make some time with them." To which he replied, "I have no desire to make time with riffraff like that." "Why riffraff?" "'Cause I work with them in the same institute, and I know what they're really like." "And what are they really like?" "In the first place, they're rowdies. Secondly, they're lazy and slovenly. It's only here that they try to keep up appearances and make people think they're nice and smart. It's quite clear that they've come here especially to find themselves husbands among the wealthier class. You've noticed how they play up to the Armenian men on board." I had an opportunity to see for myself the discrepancy he mentioned when I paid a subsequent late afternoon visit to the Design Institute to see my table companions from the cruise ship. To put it mildly, they weren't nearly as impressive as they had been on board, and all their former cheerfulness and pleasantness had somehow vanished, which means that back on the ship they were putting on false image. Many men and women in the world today try to find their other half with the aid of an external image which doesn't correspond with their real nature. Perhaps such a sad phenomenon is due to an obliviousness to other people's methods. In that case, both parties end up being deceived. A man will give flowers and expensive gifts to an image which has taken his fancy. He may go so far as to offer his hand and his heart. Then, after marriage, all of a sudden he sees her real character, which doesn't appeal to him at all. He feels a sense of irritation and a yearning for the earlier image, which has now vanished. A woman all of a sudden sees that the suitor who has only recently was so kind and attentive to her doesn't love or understand her at all. How did this happen? But he never did love her. He only loved the image. The striking discrepancy between the artificial image and the real person is particularly evident in the case of entertainment celebrities, especially if you should happen to see them in their everyday lives. A situation no less unfortunate arises from the fact that women often change their outward appearance after marriage. When a man falls in love with a woman, especially at first sight, it is difficult to say what specifically has aroused the feeling of love in him. Perhaps it was the color of her hair, or the way she plaited her braids, or maybe her eyes. It is customary to think that the feeling of love is aroused by the whole gamut of external and internal traits. And when a woman changes her external appearance, she thereby takes away part of her appeal and weakens the love between them. Even if following a radical change of clothes, hairdo, and makeup, everybody around tells her how beautiful and attractive she's become, and even if these compliments ring true, and even if her husband gets excited over his wife's new look, it may be only a matter of time before his love begins to fade or disappears altogether. After all, he has glimpsed a great many beautiful women who are a lot more attractive than his wife at present. Still, he has fallen in love specifically with her and with the appearance she had when they first met, and all of a sudden that previous image is no longer there. And you will, no doubt, agree that in falling in love with the new image, he thereby betrays the image she presented before. Why were people in ancient times so cautious about changing their clothing? Perhaps they didn't have much in the way of a selection of fabrics, but they did. They imported silks from far across the seas, and they themselves knew how to weave cloth, either coarse or fine. They could do all sorts of designs on the cloth with different coloring agents or embroidering them. Perhaps they were lacking in imagination or finances. They had plenty of imagination, in abundance in fact. Practically every other person was a fine artist or designer. You only have to look at houses from those times, how they are all decorated with wood carvings. And every woman was a master of embroidery. As for finances, both people of modest means and even those well off were very conservative when it came to changes of clothing or hairdos. They were extremely cautious about altering their own appearance, being careful to preserve their image. The current fashion world, especially women, is wont to change their image like a kaleidoscope. Such extreme fashion swings are extraordinarily profitable to the clothing manufacturing industry, when people throw out things that are still perfectly serviceable and buy new fashions in hopes that they will bring something new in the way of a semblance of happiness. But no, it never comes. In its place appears only a new artificial image someone has created, an image people put on the influence of aggressive propaganda. In all the round of modern life, I never have discovered any efficient system of measures designed to help people find a lifelong companion. Not only that, but I have been getting more and more the impression that our modern living, indeed our whole way of life, is designed in such a way that we shall never meet our true soulmate. Maybe this situation even works to somebody's advantage. A man who is dissatisfied with life, who has no goals or meaning in his life, can be a profitable catch for many a man out to make money, not to mention profitable to the powers that be. As to the question of whether or not we are actually seeking out our other half, I think the answer will be no. We are not. We do not know how to, and there are no favorable conditions to facilitate the search. I attempted to discover sagacious hints on finding one's soulmate in the rites of bygone centuries. I shall cite a few typical examples of wedding rites. Let us examine just how sagacious or primitive they are. I shall include my own commentaries as we go along, but if you don't happen to agree with them, you can always cross them out or white them out and write in your own, right here in the book. I find myself tapping more and more into the feeling that Anastasia's grandfather is right. If we don't start thinking for ourselves, we'll go on accepting any sort of crap as the wisdom of life. I shan't even name the modern weddings, apart from drunkenness, tripping around in cars, and laying flour at the so-called eternal flame. There's precious little worth saying. Let's take a closer look then at some earlier wedding rites. Chapter 4. Wedding Rites. I shall cite a typical rite from the pre-revolutionary Russia with a view to examining it from the standpoint of social degradation in relation to love. Courting rituals in Perm. Weddings for the people of Perm involve a whole complex of preliminary operations. First, a father has to seek permission from the local authorities and from the parish priest before setting about courting a bride for his son. This kind of procedure invariably takes place without the participation of the groom, evidently according to ancient custom, and is limited to just the opinion of relatives and close friends called to give advice. And these are the ones who will decide the fate of their closest relative's future well-being. It happens that the groom first meets his intended only after the matchmaker has already reached an agreement with the bride's father, and sometimes not until the day of the wedding. Rarely does a young Permian have the chance to court his future bride on his own. The groom's father seeks out on his son's behalf a bride with a fair-sized dowry, a maiden of character and respectable moral standing. Once the final decision had been made as to which girl is to be targeted, the courting itself begins, known as the Correspond. This task is always entrusted to the family elder or, in his absence, to the godfather, or one of the older relations, or to someone who has had experience in such matters. It is further explained how and what the go-betweens should say. But it seems to me the whole process is utterly absurd, since the primary principle is violated right from the start. As we can see, there is not even a hint of the young people's love in carrying out this rite. Sad, too, is the fact that with this abusive attitude toward the energy of love, they are implicating God. In preparation for the groom's departure to bring back his bride, the groom's mother or matron of the house places on the tablecloth a loaf of bread intended for the blessings of the groom, along with salt, beer, and braga, and lights the candles in front of the icons. The groom prays and bows low at his mother's and father's feet, seeking their blessing. After reciting Jesus' prayer, he takes up a position at the table as all the wedding guests approach reciting the same prayer. One after another they reach out with both hands to present the groom with gifts and goodies they have brought, a cooked shoulder or a cut of raw pork, always with bread, and each one chants, "Accept these precious gifts, young prince," followed by the prayer, "Lord Jesus Christ," and so forth. At this, the groom replies to each one individually, "Amen to your prayer," before accepting, also with both hands, the gifts of food, placing each one first on his head and then on the table, and honors each wedding guest. With beer and braga, on rare occasions wine, as he recites Jesus' prayer and intones, "Drink this to your health," name of guest. This naturally meets with a response from each wedding guest the groom addresses with the words, "Amen to your prayer." Taking the glass from the groom, he bows to the groom and intones, "May the Lord grant you long life, great happiness, good living. May he grant you to attain happiness, cattle, a full stomach, and bread and salt. Obtain a young princess, accompany the princess to the church as her swain. Retain a standing position beneath the golden crowns and maintain the law of God." And then the guest takes a drink. And here is some more intriguing information. Permian women rarely preserve their virginity, but their groom pays no special attention to this, and do not avoid such women, but rather accept them eagerly, even those who are pregnant, anticipating the speedy arrival of another worker in the family. It is said that the father in some families, considering their daughters to be blameless, will resent any attempt at matchmaking, will swear and even chase away the go-betweens, sometimes even beating them, saying, "What, you're telling me my daughter is pena?" That is guilty, from the word peña, meaning guilt. So we end up not with a continuer of the family line conceived in love, but a worker for the household. There are, in fact, many characteristic features of wedding rites which portray our ancestors as wild barbarians. I should point out, however, that none of the rites we know are traditionally Slavic. Even though they're sometimes called traditional in the literature on the subject, they stem from a period when the really traditional, wise rites were prohibited by the Church, with nothing rational offered in their place. So, for example, removing the boots. It happened, and in some places still happens, according to a native Russian custom, that newlywed woman is supposed to remove her husband's footwear. In ancient times, this custom generally signified meekness, a servile attitude, even humiliation, since who would take off another's boots if she were not fully subordinate to the wearer of the boots? History teaches us that this custom existed at the time of Vladimir's reign, along with the fact that the Prince of Polotsk's daughter was unwilling to remove her husband's footwear. The same custom existed in Germany during the Martin Luther's time. On their wedding night, the young wife would take off her husband's boots and place them at the head of the bed as a sign of the husband's domination over the wife, the man over the enslaved woman. Olerius and von Herberstein observed from their stays in Moscow that even princes' and noblemen's weddings included the rituals of footwear removal along with 3 strokes of the whip. The whip was then placed together with baked goods in a special box. This rite was continued in Lithuania before the Jagiellonian dynasty and is still preserved in peasant culture. As we can see, the taking off of boots and honoring the bride's slave status is mistakenly passed off as a traditional Russian rite. But before the princes came along, Russia had no slavery at all. Hence, this rite is not traditional for our people, but a transient custom not accepted by the people at large. But there is one situation which strikes me as even more stupid, cruel, and immoral, a situation typical of wedding rites among people as late as the 18th or 19th century. Directly the last food dish is placed on the table, i.e. the roast, the best man wraps up the dish, along with the bread and salt, in a tablecloth and takes it to a bed in the hayloft, to which the young couple are led immediately afterward. Whereupon the father of the bride, in handing over his newlywed daughter to her husband, stands in the doorway of the hayloft and offers her seemly advice about marriage life. After the young couple have reached the bed, the wife of the master of ceremonies, wearing 2 coats at once, one in the normal fashion, the other turned inside out, showers them with grains, coins, and hops, and feeds the young couple on their bed. The next morning, all the wedding guests show up at the hayloft and quickly remove the blankets so as to determine by the well-known signs whether the newlywed girl has been chaste at the time of her marriage. This part of the rite may be considered the most sinister and perverted, even if the newlyweds were in love with each other. In the sight of all the guests, the young people, having eaten and drunk their fill, were supposed to go into their room and to consummate their marriage without fail, accompanied and encouraged by lustful, one might even say perverted, stares of the guests. At the first place, after all, the ups and downs of the prenuptial preparations, not to mention the wedding itself, the free-flowing libations of alcohol, and the generous intake of food, it is best to hold off sexual intimacy for a period of time, so as to avoid the conceiving of a child in such a condition. Secondly, why should newlyweds enter into intimate relations the same day, and, on top of that, to be called to account for their actions in front of the guests? What if the bride happens to be having her period on that day? All in all, it is something resembling the imposed mating of animals, or even worse. Nobody in their right mind would think of bringing a bitch to a male dog, or a cow to a bull, or a ewe to a ram, when the female is not in heat. But the attitude here is, you better get on with it, or you'll be put to shame. The following story was told to me by a 70-year-old man upon learning that I was investigating various rites. I was living in the country when I got married. They fixed me up with the one that I loved. She was oh so quiet and kind. Her name was Kisusha. She was 19 then, I was 20. We had been looking at each other for about 6 months, and we were probably in love. On the first night of our wedding, when everything was winding down, the two of us were sent to bed in a separate room. They placed a guard at the door, and the following morning they were supposed to hold up the sheet for all to see. Was the blood of virginity there or not? The moment of decision for Kasusha and me came. Maybe it was wedding jitters, or maybe something I ate, but I got the feeling nothing was going to happen between Kasusha and me. She did this and that and began awkwardly showing me her breasts, and then she kissed me and later got undressed completely. Only there was no proper reaction in me to her caresses and undressing, and I got more and more embarrassed. I sat down on the bed and turned my face to the wall. I felt Kashusha's cheek press against my back. I could feel her trembling and her tears running down my spine. I too began weeping for sorrow. There we were, both sitting on the bed, crying our hearts out. After that, I told her, "Don't worry, Kashusha. I'll declare to everyone that it's my fault." And she replied, "Don't. They'll only make fun of you." Before the dawn came, she did the piercing herself with her finger, and the blood came out. In the morning, they showed off the sheet to the great amusement of the guests, who were once more imbibing in an effort to counteract the effects of their hangover. They summoned us in their half-drunk state, joking around the necks around and calling out "Gorko, Gorko" before taking their next glass. Kashusha and I lived together for 6 months in the country, then moved to the city and divorced. Turned out I couldn't get anything to happen all those 6 months. I married again, and now I have 4 kids, 3 sons and a daughter, and grandchildren too. But that horrendous wedding I'll never forget my whole life long, and I still remember Kashusha to this day. Chapter 5. Conception involves more than flesh. Those who have read my Book of Kin will remember that the Vedras wedding rite I described with the loving couple Lyubomila and Radomir conceiving a child. But back then I wasn't about to ask Anastasia whether there were any particular aspects of the Vedras civilization concerning the conception of children, or whether or not it was worth paying special attention to this topic in any case. But as though anticipating my question, she said, "The Vedras people had a deep understanding of what was involved in the conception of their children. But for the moment, I do not understand how to talk about it in a way you will be able to understand." Later on, after my conversation with Anastasia's grandfather and my search for various people's rights capable of preserving love in families, I obtained some information on conception and realized that it had nothing to do with Anastasia. I was the one who had not been ready to comprehend what she said. Even now, this question has not been sufficiently researched by modern science. Scholars have been attempting to clone man, but it seems that even if they succeed, they will end up with an entity only superficially resembling man. You see, it is not just the sperm and the egg that are involved in the act of conception, but something else besides, something invisible, something not tangible as matter. It is possible that any further exposition of the information I obtained will be shocking to some. I spent 6 months pondering whether it was something worth sharing with my readers or not. In the end, I decided that it was. Here's what it's all about. Many families living on the earth today are unknowingly raising children that are not their own in the fullest sense. This statement is supported by some weighty evidence. The scientific world has a term, telogeny. In medicine, it is called the partial impression phenomenon. They try to talk as little as possible about telogeny. What's this all about? The discovery began in England about 150 years ago when Lord Morton decided to raise a new breed of horse with exceptionally resilient characteristics. At one point, he crossed a thoroughbred mare with a zebra colt, but no offspring resulted. because of the genetic incompatibility of the two species. Sometime later, this purebred English mare was crossed with a purebred English colt. Subsequently, the mare gave birth to a foal, only with marked traces of stripes, as with the zebra. Lord Morton called this phenomenon telogeny. Specialists in animal husbandry quite often encounter this phenomenon in their practice. Any dog breeding club, for example, will dispose of even what was the most thoroughbred dam if it happened to mate with a mongrel. That particular dam would no longer produce thoroughbred pups, even if it were to be mated with the most thoroughbred sires. Pigeon breeders will not hesitate to kill even the most precious purebred pigeon if it has been violated by a non-thoroughbred male pigeon. Practice has shown that it will never produce purebred offspring. Scientists in various countries have done a great many studies showing that this phenomenon also extends to people. There have been instances where white parents have given birth to black children, where a black-skinned baby has come into the world as a result of a liaison between the grandmother or mother of the birthing woman and a black man. The cause of this phenomenon always turns out to be a previous relationship with a black man on the part of the girl or one of her direct progenitors. But these are clearly distinguishable cases. How many others are there that are not clearly distinguishable? After all, premarital relations are the in thing today. That being the case, there's no point in blaming the woman if she is not a virgin when she marries. It is our society, our monstrous sex propaganda and sex industry that have made her that way. In the West, parents supply their school-age children with condoms, realizing that they are no longer chaste. But what they don't know is that there is no condom that can counter the paternal impression phenomenon, or telogeny. This is evidenced in concrete examples in the case of both people and animals. Many ancient teachings and religions also speak about the phenomenon of telogeny. Even though they may call it something else, the substance is the same. Both scientists and wise men of old have determined that the first man in the life of a virgin leaves his imprint on her in spirit and in blood, a mental and physical portrait of her offspring to come. All other men who enter into intimate relations with her thereafter, for childbearing purposes, have nothing to offer her but their semen and diseases of the flesh. Isn't this what's behind the current massive lack of understanding of fathers and their children? Not to mention the degradation of our whole human society of today. A multitude of specific examples testifies to the involvement of some kind of energy in the conception of children. But if that is the case, then it is not just scientists, but the public at large that should know about it. This is probable that our recent forebears had some inkling of it. They tried to make sure that a girl entering into marriage was a virgin beyond the shadow of a doubt. It is possible that this is what lies behind the custom in many cultures of locking the newlyweds in a separate room and subsequently hauling out and putting on display the blood-stained sheet in confirmation of the bride's virginity. Earlier ancestors of ours, however, did not consider virginity in itself sufficient to qualify someone to be a continuer of the line. They maintained that if a woman was engaged in intimate relations with one man while thinking about another, the resulting offspring would bear resemblance to the one she was thinking about. Such statements indicate that people of old assumed, and quite possibly knew for certain, that the most important factor in conception was thought, or more specifically, the energy of thought. The phenomenon of telogeny also testifies to this. A woman, perhaps subconsciously, retains information in her memory about the first man in her life. As a result, a child is born who either fully or partially resembles him. At first, I hesitated to write about this subject for fear of provoking unpleasant questions among parents and their children, and between spouses. Let them be happy in their ignorance. However, such happiness has not been all that noticeable, and perhaps one of the reasons it is not particularly noticeable is a lack of knowledge as to the culture of conception. The question of sex education courses for children in schools has been an issue for some time now. People argue over whether they should be introduced or not. If such courses touch only upon the use of condoms, there is no point in introducing the courses at all. If, however, children are told about the woman's chief purpose, about the correct approach to conceiving children, in that case the subject is absolutely essential. For that, however, the instructors must have a thorough grounding in the very essence of the question, and have appropriate literature available. It is a subject that must be discussed, even though the mass media, unfortunately, serves up nothing but sex propaganda. There's a lot of talk in so-called democratic countries about human freedom. But can a man be called truly free when important questions of life are hidden from him, and in their place allegedly beneficial perversions are fobbed off on him through some kind of supposedly free propaganda? In a situation like that, it turns out that man is liberated only from a true and happy human life. Still, I wouldn't have written about telogyny if I hadn't learned from Anastasia about how to correct this situation. Even if the marriage-bound woman has already had relationship with another man. Not only that, but it turns out that the Vedras people had a momentous rite through which stepchildren could become one's own in blood and spirit. Our pagan ancestors, the Vedras, all the more so, were very well acquainted with what is known in modern medicine as the paternal impression phenomenon. And through the help of special rites, they were able to protect their young people against it. With the aid of particular acts or rites, wise men, too, were able to erase the genetic code of the first sire, and make even girls who had been raped during enemy attacks absolutely clean. As proof of this, they were not afraid to let their sons take such women in marriage. However, there is one but. It is impossible to understand and reproduce pagan, and especially Vedras rites, simply through a knowledge of their outward aspects. They must be experienced through feeling. What's the use in just writing about it? It is essential to love. It is essential to prepare for the appearance of the child. It is important to give birth only at home, at the very place of conception. To preserve love in the family forever, it is essential to combine into one 3 points, 3 feelings, 3 planes of being. But what's the point in simply restating the words? An intellectual understanding is far from sufficient. It must be felt. The philosophy of our forebears must be felt. And the first essential act must be one of sheer repentance in respect to our forebears, who are now called pagans, who have been slandered and whom we have betrayed. We betrayed the traditional Slavic cultures of our fathers and mothers, a culture that lasted for tens of thousands of years. Instead, we started calling Christianity traditional for Rus. But in Rus, it has been around for a mere 1,000 years. There's no way it can be classified as traditional. Why is repentance necessary? For the simple reason that if we go on thinking of our ancestors as wild, dull-witted barbarians, as we are urged to believe, but still adopt their rites, those rites will have no effect. After all such rites are founded on a knowledge of the cosmos, of the designated purpose of the planets, and on a knowledge of the power of mental energy, the power of thought. Even if we try harnessing the tremendous energy of our thought with the aid of their rites, we shall not obtain any positive results, since our thought will be contradicted by another thought of ours, namely that the Vedras people were ignorant. Hence a paradox. You're an ignorant fool, but your acts are marvelous. The one excludes, or at least contradicts, the other. Perhaps the culture of our forebears is being deliberately concealed from us. After all, a bunch of ignorant and disoriented people cut off from their roots are easier to control. Perhaps this is God's retribution to our civilization. Popular wisdom says, "What you sow, you shall reap." We have broken the ties with our forebears, and consequently the threads linking us with our children are also being broken. We can get another glimpse of the elevated culture of our pagan forebears in the question of conception of children by examining the traditions that are even today preserved in modern China and especially Japan, where a man and a woman about to enter into intimate relations for the purposes of conceiving a child undergo a special rite of purification. The beliefs of ancient China, Japan, India, and ancient Greece, and these are traditionally ancient pagan countries, lay tremendous emphasis on the matter of conception. So what, then, can anyone do who desires to bring forth good offspring? Should they first spend a lot of time studying the volumes of literature on this subject, besides spending a lot of time on studying treatises on choosing one's soulmate and on the education of children? I can tell you right off, there's absolutely no need to waste part of one's own life on such study. I myself spent several years not studying such sources, but simply familiarizing myself with them, and I came to the sudden realization that the Vedras people have condensed all their monumental works into a system of simple, cheerful, and rational rites covering all events of one's life. It gives the impression that God himself helped them in formulating these rites, as well as in understanding the essence of man's existence. Before attempting to apply the experience of our ancestors, we need to determine which ancestors. I mean, how many years ago? And which territories of present-day Russia were settled by our forebears? As is known, history textbooks, including those written in Russia, tell about people's lives in Egypt and Rome of 5,000 years ago. These countries have carried out, and are still carrying out, archaeological excavations, which draw huge crowds of tourists every year. Russian history, on the other hand, if we take the word of even our own history books, covers a mere 1,000-year period. That would mean our country's territory before that time was somehow home to a culturally backward people, or maybe there wasn't anybody there at all. Either that, or possibly somebody's been deliberately hiding our history from us. Indeed they have. I have already written about this, but now I should like to present some archaeological data. I shall tell you about Arkham, a place which has a direct connection with the question of phylogeny. According to Anastasia's grandfather, it was there that 3,500 years ago a remarkable discovery was made. Chapter 6. Into the Depths of History. Arkham, Academy of the Wise Men. In 1952, satellites sent back to the Earth photographs of several unusual circles clearly delineated on the surface of the southern Ural steppe. No one doubted that these circles had been artificially produced, though nobody could say exactly what they were. A debate was raging in both scientific and occult circles of the time as to where one should look for the original Indo-European homeland. Not without some justification, scientists posited that the many European peoples, as well as those of India, Persia, and part of Asia, could be traced back to a single source, a mystery people known as the Proto-Indo-Europeans. Many researchers have dreamt of finding the remains of the land where once lived the legendary white Aryan race. Researchers have been attempting to reach the fringes of the lost, ancient, and precious knowledge which the ancient Aryans possessed. When excavations began in the Arkham Valley, archaeologists announced to the academic world that an ancient city dating back more than 40 centuries had been unearthed, and that it had been inhabited by people of the ancient Indo-European civilization. The researchers started calling Arkham a city, a temple, and an observatory all at the same time. Whoever is interested in the academics' hypotheses can read about them in specialized literature on the subject. I shall pass on what Anastasia's grandfather told me about Arcane. The logic of his thinking is much more accurate and intriguing than the logic underlying the scholar's scientific hypotheses. He stated right off, Arcane is not a city and not a temple. The part about the observatory is true, but that's not the main thing here. Arcane is an academy. That's what it would be called today. It was in Arcane that the teachers of the wise men lived and worked. Here they engaged in research on the universe. They also determined the interrelationship of celestial bodies and their influence on man. Their tremendous discoveries were never recorded, nor did they make long speeches in public. Through their many years of research, they worked out the rites, presented them to the people, and subsequently kept track of how effective they were. They made corrections as required. They were able to sum up their lengthy researches in a brief word or two which signified the substance of their discovery. For example, there are some very early rites, such as the Savior of the Honey, the 14th of July, and the Savior of the Apple, the 19th of July. People did not use any new crop apples until the Savior of the Apple feast, or any new gatherings of honey until the honey feast. Through their lengthy researches and observations, the wise men discovered that up until this date the apple does not give any significant benefit to man, even if it is ripe, and this goes far beyond just the apple. Many berries, edible herbs, and root vegetables beneficial to man ripen before the apple feast. If man began to eat apples too soon, he would not have room left for the produce that was more beneficial to him at this very time. It was these wise men who discovered that the particular sequence of fruit and vegetable ripening in nature is no mere coincidence. It is this very sequence that constitutes man's divine dietary regime, which the science of the centuries to follow would be researching for in vain. Volumes of treatises could be written about how they conducted their research. The wise men, however, never compiled any, and did not burden people with the task of reading them. They imparted their conclusions to people, in ready-made form, in just a few words, and people believed the wise men. Their advice invariably proved true in life. Besides, there is no comparison between the Vedras wise men and their counterparts in Greece. The Egyptian priests, or today's acclaimed academic lights. The Vedras wise men never received any honors or rewards for their remarkable discoveries. They could not accumulate wealth or power that, say, the Egyptian priests enjoyed. And they were not given the kind of adoration showered upon many in church hierarchies today. The only thing a wise man could expect upon arriving at a certain settlement was food and any replacement clothing or footwear he might need, as well as a place where he could lay his head, though some wise men might decline the offer of shelter in favor of sleeping under the stars in the open air. Beyond that, he enjoyed the people's sincere, unfeigned respect. Over the centuries, such an arrangement ensured the selection of only the best teachers and thinkers among the people. The receptive populace also showed their gratitude by building, according to the wise men's own designs, complexes like Arcane, where the wise men could retreat for meditation and mutual sharing of thoughts. Here they would tell each other of their discoveries and describe the rites they had come up with based on their discoveries. It was something on the order of a supreme academic council. Most of the time, ordinary people didn't even know who was behind any given rite, or whom they had to thank for a particularly insightful and effective rite. There was one wise man, for example, an acclaimed philosopher, astronomer, and psychologist, who devoted 90 years to the study of how to combat the phenomenon we know today as telogeny. He discovered a cure and offered people an effective remedy, consisting of a rite of only 15 minutes in duration. True, the preparation for the rite took a lot longer. Why don't you ask Anastasia, Vladimir? She might tell you about it. Only I'll say right off, this rite can be felt only through an understanding of the feelings of love possessed by our distant ancestors, the philosophy of their love. The further back you manage to go with your thought, the more you'll be able to make sense of the rite. To be more thoroughly persuaded of the truth of what Anastasia's grandfather has said regarding Arkham, let us take a look at its architecture. Arkham has the form of a circle with an exterior diameter of approximately 160 meters. As you can see, that's rather small for a city, but I shall still call it a city, as scholars at the moment are doing. It is surrounded by a 2-meter wide perimeter trench, outside a massive exterior wall. The wall was 5.5 meters high and 5 meters thick. There were 4 entrances in the wall, the largest facing southwest. The other 3 were smaller, located on opposite sides. All the entrances led directly into the only ring road, about 5 meters wide, which separated the dwellings attached to the outer wall from the inner ring of walls. This ring road was covered with logs, under which, for the whole length of the street, ran a dug-out 2-meter wide ditch, which connected with the perimeter trench. Thus the city had its own storm drainage system. Surplus water would seep through the logs into the ditch and eventually into the perimeter trench. All the dwellings attached to the outer wall, like lemon sections, had doorways on the main street. No more than 35 dwellings were discovered around the outer circle. That's not much, even for a village. Next, we see the mysterious ring of the inner wall, which was even more massive than the outer one. 3 meters thick, it reached a height of 7 meters. According to the excavation findings, there was no entrance through this wall except for a small passageway at the southeast point. Hence, another 25 interior dwellings, identical to those around the outer perimeter wall, were practically cut off from everything by a thick, high inner wall. In order to reach the little passageway to the inner ring, one had to travel the whole length of the ring road. This had a hidden significance. Anyone entering the city had to travel the same path as the sun. Finally, Arkham was crowned by a central plaza almost square in shape, approximately 25 by 27 meters. Judging by the traces of fire spread out in particular pattern, this plaza was used for some kind of rites. Thus we see the schematic figure of a mandala, a square inside of a circle. In ancient cosmogonic texts, the circle symbolizes the universe, the square, the earth, our material world. Ancient men of wisdom, who had a perfect knowledge of the structure of the cosmos, saw how naturally and harmoniously it was constructed. And so, in building a city, it was like recreating the universe in miniature. Arkham was built according to a predetermined plan as a single complex whole, oriented with extreme precision to celestial bodies. The design resulting from the 4 entrances in Arkham's outer wall form a right-facing swastika, reflecting the clockwise movement of the sun. The swastika, in Sanskrit, connected with good, the best success, is one of the most ancient sacred symbols. It is encountered as far back as the Upper Paleolithic period. In the cultures of many of the world's peoples, including those of India, ancient Rus, China, and Egypt, as well as of the mysterious Mayan people in Central America, to name but a few. The swastika may be seen in old Orthodox icons. It is the symbol of the sun, success, happiness, and creativity. Correspondingly, a backwards, left-facing swastika symbolizes darkness and destruction, the nighttime sun of the dwellers of ancient Rus. Both swastikas were used, as may be seen on ancient ornaments, in particular on the Aryan jars found around Arkham. This has a deep significance. Day takes the place of night. light the place of darkness, and a new birth takes the place of death. And this is the natural order of things in the universe. Hence, in antiquity, there was no such thing as good or bad swastika. They were perceived as a unified entity, like the energy of yin and yang in the Orient. Arkham was outwardly beautiful, the ideal circular city marked by distinctive gate towers, burning torches, and a beautifully formed facade, probably featuring some kind of meaningful sacral pattern. Everything in Arkham, after all, was fraught with meaning. Each dwelling was attached on one side to either the outer or inner wall, and faced either the main ring road or the central plaza. In the improvised entrance hall to each dwelling was a special watercourse, which emptied into the ditch under the main street. The ancient Aryans were thus provided with a sewer system. Not only that, but each dwelling had its own well, furnace, and a small cupola-shaped storage area. From each well, above the water level, 2 earthen pipes branched out. One led to the furnace, the other to the storage area. What for? Quite brilliant, actually. We all know that if you glance down a well, you will invariably feel a current of cool air. So, in the Aryan furnaces, this cool air passing through an earthen pipe created such a strong draught that it was capable of melting bronze with no need for bellows. There was a furnace like that in every dwelling, and all the ancient blacksmiths had to do was to perfect their craft and compete with their artistic rivals. The other earthen pipe leading to the storage area ensured a lower temperature there. The famous Russian astroarchaeologist Konstantin Konstantinovich Bystrukin researched Arkham as an astronomical observatory and came to the following conclusion. Arkham is not just a complex installation, but it is subtle in its complexity. In examining its schematics, one can easily see parallels with the well-known Stonehenge monument in England. For example, the diameter of the inner circle of Arkham is always reported as being exactly 85 meters. In fact, it is a circle with 2 radiuses, 40 meters and 43.2 meters. Try drawing it. Compare that to the radius of Stonehenge Aubrey's whole ring, which is also 43.2 meters. Stonehenge and Arkham are positioned at approximately the same latitude, and both are at the center of a bowl-shaped valley. The distance between them is almost 4,000 kilometers. Researchers have determined that on the basis of these known facts, Arkham amounts to a horizon observatory. Why a horizon observatory specifically? Because the measurings and observations made there are based on the moment of the rising and setting of the sun and the moon on the horizon. The recording of the moment of disengagement or touching down of the lower edge of the disk on the horizon allows the accurate determination of the place of this event. If we keep track of sunrises on a daily basis, we shall note that the actual point of sunrise shifts from day to day, reaching its northern limit on the 22nd of June. This point then moves south to its opposite apogee on the 22nd of December. This is part of the cosmic order. That means there are 4 visible points of observation of the sun each year, 2 points of sunrise on the 22nd of June and on the 22nd of December, and 2 corresponding points of sunset on the western horizon. Add to these 2 more points, namely sunrise and sunset during the equinox, the 22nd of March and the 22nd of September. This offered a sufficiently accurate determination of the length of a year. However, a year is made up of a whole host of singular events, and these can be determined with the aid of that other celestial bodies, namely the moon. Regardless of the complexity involved in its observation, people of old knew the laws of its movement across the Empyrean. Here are a few of them. 1. The moon, which occurs closest to the 22nd of June, is observed at the point of the winter solstice, 22nd of December, and vice versa. 2. Lunar events can be observed near the points of the solstice on a 19-year cycle, high and low moon. As an observatory, Arcame allowed astronomers to follow the events of the moon. It is possible to note 18 astronomical events just on these huge circular walls alone. 6 of them are connected with the sun and 12 with the moon, including the high and low moon. By comparison, researchers at Stonehenge were able to identify only 15 cosmic events. In addition to information about these amazing factual events, the following data were obtained. The Arcame unit of measurement of length is 80 centimeters. The center of the inner circle shows a displacement from the center of the outer circle by a factor of 5.25 Arcame units, which is close to the moon's orbital inclination, 5 degrees 9 plus or minus 10 minutes. In Bystrushkin's opinion, this reflects the correlation between the orbits of the moon and the sun for the terrestrial observer. Correspondingly, Arcame's outer circle is dedicated to the moon, its inner circle to the sun. Not only that, but archaeological measurements have shown a link between some of Arcame's parameters and the wobbling of the Earth's axis. This is getting into some pretty sophisticated science, even in terms of modern astronomy. And so we see that by any stretch of the imagination, Arcame hardly falls under the category of city. Its extremely small rooms offer no accommodation for families, but serve as an ideal space for philosophical reflections. Historians know that in ancient times so-called wise men were considered to be scientists and teachers. Consequently, it is possible that Arcame, as one of the most celebrated scientific centers, could have belonged exclusively to these wise men. There were simply no other scientists around in those times. It is also known that the wise men devised and adjusted their rites on the basis of their knowledge of the cosmos. The question is, what has become of these unique rites today? What kind of obscurantism has destroyed them or is concealing them from people's view? What is the message of Sungir? And now I should like to bring to your attention some even more sensational news, eclipsing that of even the pyramids of Egypt or the ruins of ancient Rome. This information is also needed, as Anastasia's grandfather said, in order to better understand the phenomena and knowledge of the universe prevalent in our ancient forebears' time. And for that, we have to delve as deeply as possible into history. The Siberian recluse said, furthermore, if your thought can dig down to 3,000 years ago, you will begin to gradually feel the knowledge of 3 millennia. If it can go as deep as 5,000 years, then 5 millennia, though not everything you discover will be comprehensible to you. You actually need a minimum of 19,000 years. This attempt to dig into our country's historical past seemed to me utterly unfeasible. I was already prepared to go off to India or Tibet, where it is said one can learn more about our ancestors than here at home. But as it turned out, there was no need to go anywhere. Everything was available right here, and now I invite everyone reading these lines to cast his thought about our forebears, more than 19,000 years back in time. The archaeological finds I'm about to describe were made by mere chance on the outskirts of the city of Vladimir, which, according to official sources, is approximately 1,015 years old. In 1955, while excavating a clay pit mine for the Vladimir Ceramics factory, Alexander F. Nacharov discovered in one of the buckets the bones of some very large animal, which had been resting at a depth of 3 meters. Archaeologists were informed about the discovery. The first excavations thereafter simply astounded the scientists. Buried on the site were the remains of people, jewelry, clothing, ornamentation, and everyday objects, all testifying to some kind of ancient culture. Further investigation confirmed that our ancestors had arrived on the banks of the Klyazma River as early as the Old Stone Age, approximately 25,000 years ago. Now, somebody could be wondering whether they might have run about on all fours, dressed in homemade skins and carrying clubs. Not at all. The scientists were amazed by another finding. On the skeletons themselves, or close by, were a whole lot of jewelry and ornaments which aided in reconstructing the appearance of the clothing worn by these ancient people. Something similar to either overalls or a perfectly civilized dress. The finding is such that if we are not going to relegate these remains to the category of buried extraterrestrials, then we shall have to completely revise our whole historical outlook on the world. In one of its halls, the Vladimir State Museum of History and Ethnography mounted a special exhibition dedicated to these unique findings. It put out a booklet stating that the Sungir site is the most interesting archaeological monument in Russia and is known to archaeologists the world over. It has hosted a number of international scientific conferences. Sungir represents one of the northernmost settlements of ancient man in the Vladimir region on the Great Russian Plain. In terms of richness of both objects and state of preservation of such ancient remains, it has no compeer anywhere in the world. Thanks to the collaborative efforts of archaeologists, geologists, paleontologists, and paleobotanists, we have a fairly clear picture of how people lived back then, in this incredibly distant time period. Here, on the edge of a glacier, was where the tundra used to begin, dotted here and there with islands of fir, pine, birch, and alder groves. The animal world was quite diversified. According to the booklet, ancient Sungarians hunted the reindeer, wild horse, Arctic fox, wolverine, bison, brown bear, wolf, Arctic hare. They also went after the black grouse, jungle fowl, and herring gull. And of course they hunted the mammoth, a huge animal now extinct, almost 4 meters tall and weighing 6 tons. This represented for them a much sought-after trophy. Meat, skins, indispensable in constructing dwellings, and tusks, a solid and superb material for the preparation of both weapons and ornaments. The inventory of objects made from bone and horn is most interesting. Shaft adjusters, hoes, spearheads, arrowheads, and beads from mammoth tusks. Jewelry made from the fangs of the Arctic fox. A small silhouetted figure of a large-headed horse came to be recognized as a rare example of primitive art. This famous Sungir horse was decorated with tiny dotted ornaments and red ochre. The number of dots on the figure, a multiple of 5, testifies to the use of a quinary counting system among the inhabitants of the site. The 7-base system points to the knowledge possessed by the people living 25,000 years ago. But it is the unique burial sites of these ancient people that have brought global fame to Sungir. In 1964, in a heavy layer of ochre-colored rock, was found the skull of a woman. Lower still were the remains of an elderly man. On his chest was a pendant made from a pebble, while on his arms were 25 plate bracelets made from mammoth tusks. In addition, on the skull, all along the arms, legs, and torso, almost 3,500 beads were arranged in rows. The pattern of their arrangement on the skeleton allowed scientists to reconstruct the embroidered costume of this ancient Sungarian. It was reminiscent of the fur clothing worn by Arctic peoples today. At the bottom of the shallow grave, they discovered a knife and some kind of scraper made of flint. Just as much a treasure was the next burial site, unearthed some 5 years later. This grave contained the remains of an adult body, but without a skull. Beside it lay a necklace of mammoth tusk beads, a ring, and a pair of reindeer antlers. But farther back, at 65 centimeters below the upper grave, were found 2 skeletons of children. A boy of 12 or 13 and a girl between 7 and 9 had been placed in the grave in a stretched position, their heads pressed tightly against each other. Children, on their way to the next world, were accompanied by hunting weapons made from mammoth tusks, 11 darts, 3 daggers, and 2 spears made out of split and straightened tusks, one 2.5 meters and the other 1.5 meters long. The grave also yielded mammoth tusk rods, very expressive figurines of a horse and a mammoth, carved discs of an apparently ceremonial nature, and connected with the worship of the sun and the moon. The children's clothing, too, was embroidered with thousands of little beads and fastened across the chest with pins made of bones. The back of the costume had been outfitted with threads of beads in the shape of animal tails. This finding testifies to the complex rite of burial and the developed religious beliefs of the ancient people of the Stone Age. One may confidently assume that they believed in the afterlife. Multidisciplinary archaeological investigations have been going on at Sungir with a few interruptions. Ever since 1956, for almost 20 years, the project was under the supervision of the famous archaeologist Dr. Otto Nikolaevich Bader. Anthropologists M.M. Gerasimov, along with his students G.V. Lebinskaya and T.S. Surnina, succeeded in reconstructing the external appearance of the ancient Sungarians. As is known, anthropologists are often able to reconstruct a person's face with sufficient accuracy on the basis of the skull. This offered a rare opportunity indeed to gaze upon the faces of ancient people, an opportunity I decided to take advantage of. A wise, intelligent-looking face on the adult male, a slightly sad expression on the young girl's face, a thoughtful one on the boy's. And yet, the presumptions about hunting, and especially the mammoth, I believe, were not entirely accurate. I brought Anastasia's grandfather to this unique exhibition in the Vladimir Museum. The old fellow slowly made his way around the displays without stopping at any of them. Then he stood in the middle of the hall and bowed 4 times, each time shifting his position by 90 degrees. When I told him about the scientist's conclusions, he began to refute a good deal of it, explaining, "These people, Vladimir, never hunted mammoths. Mammoths were their household animals, and a very great help to families. Also a way of transporting heavy loads. They performed a greater variety of tasks than elephants do today in India, which are controlled by mahouts or drivers. Standing on a mammoth, the Sungarians could gather fruit from very tall trees, then store them in woven bags and baskets, and carry them to wherever they liked. In the domain glades, the mammoths cleared out young underbrush from the forest encroaching on the glades, or, depending on the task assigned, would shake and then pull up trees so as to enlarge the glade. Whenever people had to move from one place to another, they would load their belongings, utensils, and food supplies onto the mammoth. This was a very kind and industrious household animal. Even a small child could put his fingers around the ends of the trunk and lead it about at will. Indeed, children often played with the mammoth, making it suck up water in its trunk and then give them a shower. The mammoth took great pleasure in watching how the youngsters jumped and squealed with joy. The mammoth was especially delighted, too, when his wool was combed out and removed by a special rake-like instrument. A man would wash the wool, dry it, and then use it for his own purposes, for example, in making a bed. There was absolutely no need for these people to hunt the mammoth. This can be deduced just from the information available in the booklet, which contains quite a few contradictory statements. Why contradictory? Think about it. They list all sorts of wild game which could easily be caught in sufficient numbers with the aid of special traps. If a man killed a mammoth which weighs 6 tons, he could not possibly eat all of its meat right off. But what if there were a whole... There couldn't have been that many. Back in those times, people didn't live packed tight together the way they do now in cities or towns. Each family tribe had its own lands. Each family had their own territory, their own home. On an area of 3 square kilometers might be living fewer than 100 people. Even collectively, they couldn't eat a 6-ton mammoth in just a few days, even if they didn't consume anything but meat during that time. The rotting meat would start to decompose and attract a huge number of insects. It could have started an epidemic. But maybe they invited people from other territories to some kind of feast. What sense would there be in traveling several kilometers just to eat meat, which there was enough of at home? But if you say the mammoth's decomposing carcass would run the risk of provoking an epidemic, the very same threat could be posed by a household mammoth when it died. Vladimir, a mammoth would never die in the family surroundings. When it got old and felt death approaching, it would walk a little ways away from the house and trumpet 3 times before heading off to a cemetery for mammoths, where it died. You should have known that yourself, as that is what wild elephants do in India today. Before they die, they trumpet and then leave the herd. So that means we have a very distorted understanding of how the ancient people fed themselves. Yes, that is right. Perhaps it's an attempt to justify your current barbarity in regard to the treatment of animals. The farther you go back into history, the fewer people you'll encounter eating meat. They had a sufficient supply of growing things to sustain themselves. As for animals, they took from them only what the animals themselves gave to man. Milk and eggs, for example. Meat could have been harmful to the stomach of the first people. Another argument in favor of the premise that hunting was not a basic source of food for primitive people is its illogicality by comparison with other ways of obtaining food. What other ways? From tamed, domesticated animals. Picture to yourself a man whose household includes a female mammoth, a cow, and a goat, all of which can be milked, yielding a daily supply of top-quality fresh produce. This man's household also includes domesticated fowl, a goose, a duck, a chicken, all of which provide eggs with little effort on his part. He has the opportunity of gathering honey and pollen from bees, and a great many root vegetables and edible herbs are also at hand. Then all of a sudden it appears as though the man is going out of his mind. He kills all his domestic animals, which, apart from everything else, have been guarding him when he is asleep, eats them, and begins hunting for wild game, thereby putting himself in danger without guaranteeing himself and his family a regular supply of fresh produce. In place of friendly surroundings and the love expressed to him by his household animals, he ends up with nothing but an aggressive environment in which it is virtually impossible, one might say, for his household to survive. But did the first people really begin right off to domesticate and train their animals? Maybe that came along later, at a later period. There would have been no later period for man if he had taken an aggressive stance from the start. You must be acquainted, after all, Vladimir, with situations where an infant alone in the forest may be fed even by carnivorous wolves. The very same forest where a pack of wolves could tear an adult to pieces. What would account for the discrepancy in their attitude toward man? I really can't say. Because in the first instance, the infant man has no aggression, while in the second we have aggression and fear which create unease in the surrounding environment. The first people had no sense of fear or aggression. It was love that was dominant in them, along with a genuine interest in the world around them. Consequently, it was no effort to domesticate or train animals and birds. Their primary concern was to determine the purpose of every creature they encountered on the earth. This they did. As far as the animals go, you already know that they find their own highest benefit in man's feelings of love and care for them. Meat was first consumed by a less than complete man, one drained of the energy of love. It seems that either he went out of his mind or was infected with the most terrible disease, a disease which has come down to the present day. But what connection can there be between love and man's first consumption of meat? There is a direct connection. A man living in love is incapable of killing. Possibly, but can you determine why these children died 25,000 years ago? Why they were buried in such an unusual manner, head to head like that? I could tell you, of course, but it would be a very long story. Besides, it is not important for you to know why they were overcome by death, but for what purpose? For what purpose? There you go again, Vladimir, constantly asking questions. Too lazy to think for yourself. Only don't blame me for speaking like this, the way you did back in the taiga when you let resentment take over. Think instead on the whole point of my telling you these things. What I say will bring you more harm than good if you don't begin to think for yourself. I speak and you listen, and instead of working out your own conclusions in your thought, you are merely taking note of mine. You've set yourself up a goal of finding conditions in the past under which love could remain with people forever, and then reintroducing them in the present day. That's fine, the path is correct, and the goal is the most important of all. You are trying to determine how many ages ago love began to dwell within people. Look, here is a date right before your eyes. Think about it. Right in front of you lie two children's skeletons. Their death at such a young age is meaningless unless people can realize what important information is concealed in their burial. Their death will acquire meaning if you retrieve this information right now. I didn't resent the old fellow for his remark on my laziness of mind. I had long realized that he was using some kind of methods of his own, trying again and again to teach me how to control my thoughts by alternative means. But I, after all, did not go through the same school as they, training their thought from childhood. I went to an ordinary school, which quite possibly serves to do just the opposite, to switch thought off. So here I am, standing in front of these child skeletons, straining myself mentally without being able to grasp how I can look on them and learn at least something about the love that existed 25,000 years ago. If it existed at all at that time. It did exist, the old fellow suddenly said. What made you decide that? There's not a word about love on the museum signs. Not a word, but so what? Look carefully. Judging by the skeletons, these are children. The boy is 12 and a half, the girl, she's 8. On their skeletons are hundreds of bone beads. On the basis of their arrangement, your scientists have determined what kind of clothing the children were wearing. But is that all the bone beads can tell us? What else can they tell us? That their parents, Vladimir, loved these children very much. They loved their children and they loved each other. Only loving parents could get involved in such a time-consuming ornamentation of their children's clothing. We can also tell that they had more than enough free time for artistic pursuits and for designing and then making fine clothing. Note that the objects found in the grave include absolutely no weapons capable of killing. What about the darts? Aren't those weapons? Of course not. And they're not even harpoons for catching fish, since there are no barbs on the ends. The end of the object they've called a dart is not even sharp. A thin, lightweight dart like that could hardly kill or even wound any creature. Then what was the object used for? For training and controlling animals. See how it resembles a stick animal trainers use today? Elephant drivers, for example, use sticks like that to control their charges. But why did they need to make them out of bone? They could have also taken a real stick and not wasted time straightening out the bone and putting ornaments onto it. A wooden stick couldn't last very long. Animals, on the other hand, get accustomed to a single object, its shape, and even the smell it acquires from contact with the master's hand. Right, then everything you say sounds rather convincing, but there are other objects which resemble arrowheads, and arrows were meant for killing. In the case of these specific people, who were not the very earliest period of human life on the earth, arrows were intended for scaring away carnivorous beasts when they attacked. There are also some objects that look like hoes. These indeed were instruments for planting seeds and digging up roots. But the jewelry? Look. This necklace is made from the fangs of an Arctic fox, and scientists assume that the clothing was made from leather. So they killed animals after all. Your scientists are right about their clothing being made of leather, but there was absolutely no need to kill any animal for this purpose. There were reptiles which shed their old skin on a regular basis. Reptiles might die for some reason, and then ants would eat out their insides, leaving the skin untouched, which turned out to be very useful for making clothing. Given such circumstances, it would be silly to waste time on killing such an animal, cutting up the carcass, processing and drying the skin or softening it. What for? Since it was possible to acquire a ready-made skin in an ideal condition, in the divine nature, all man's needs have been provided for in advance. As for the necklace from the fox's fangs, it was a lot simpler to take them from a skeleton already worked over and dried by nature. At this point, I'm going to interrupt for a moment Anastasia's grandfather's account about the archaeologist's unique findings. In the booklet put out by the Vladimir State Museum, there are drawings showing two exhibit halls, the Sungir Architectural Park and the Sungir Museum Complex. It mentions that the international conferences have been organized around these unique findings. However, I would not advise any great haste to visit the excavation site of this ancient civilization. There are no actual pavilions on the site, only the remains of unfinished construction, and the archaeological work is not proceeding at any intensive pace. The state has no funds for such important projects. They are going ahead, one might say, thanks to the level of enthusiasm both of the scientists involved and of the local authorities. I arrived at this unique place on a weekend. In one of the pits, I saw two men taking soil samples from the side of the pit and carefully placing them into plastic bags. They turned out to be workers from the State Archaeological Institute. They confirmed that the Sungir is considered the richest archaeological site for the study of ancient man anywhere in the world. The Vladimir Museum exhibition is the only one of its kind in Russia. They said that tourists sometimes visited the Sungir excavation site, but mainly tourists from Japan, since there is an even fuller exhibition on Sungir at the Tokyo National Archaeological Museum. It seemed pretty strange that the people in the land of the rising sun show more respect to our ancient forebears living on our country's territory than we do ourselves. Thank you, Japanese friends, for protecting the culture of our joint forebears. We talk about Russia's lofty mission, about spirituality and the need to support the national image. But what support can we talk about if foreign tourists see our relationship to history through their own eyes? Well, the only thing we can do is hope that possibly our more civilized descendants will learn what secrets still remain to be discovered in Sungir. I managed to find out that 25,000 years ago our forebears were civilized people who knew how to love passionately and preserve love forever. A family-centered society. To all appearances, in order to bring back lost effective traditions and rites capable of preserving love in families, it would seem necessary to obtain full information about the life of our forebears. To this end, we must delve even deeper into our historical past, right down to the family community-centered society. When a husband and a wife who loved each other created a family-friendly community together with their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. In today's world, a husband and a wife simply cannot hold on to even their closest relatives, their children. No sooner do their offspring approach adulthood than they try to get out from under their parents' wings. They go off and live in university residence or rent an apartment, often at considerable expense, but they still go. And we're not just talking about children. Many couples separate even before children come along, or shortly after their appearance. The family community-centered society existed many millennia in Rus before the princes came along. It was characterized by an absence of divorce and stronger family units in comparison with subsequent social structures in our history. Only genuine love is capable of starting a family line. In the past, it was much easier for grown children to leave the family than today. I'm talking about the early period in Rus before the arrival of the princes. If two young people who loved each other weren't happy with their relationships with their parents, they could leave home and set up their own dwelling on whatever territory they took a fancy to. They could start by nourishing themselves on what they found in the forest. Then they would till the ground and establish a household. But they didn't go away. That means the founders of the family line treated them with understanding and love. We need to study this period and from it draw into our modern way of life grains of logic capable of helping build strong families today. But how, by what means, can we access information about this era in people's lives when Russian history describes only the Christian period? Another factor necessitating an investigation into our people's historical past is the importance of determining whether the ancient rites and culture disappeared all by themselves, having outlined their usefulness, or whether the traditions of many millennia were deliberately destroyed. If they disappeared all on their own, then there is no point in digging into the historical past, since the people themselves rejected their ancient culture, not seeing it as useful, which means it would not be accepted today either. If, on the other hand, the ancient traditions were deliberately destroyed, then we must look into the question of by whom and for what purpose. We must seek them out, find them, and present them to society for evaluation. It is possible the ancient rites and traditions conceal within themselves such important secrets of human existence that without uncovering them we shall continue to move toward an abyss, die out, and torment ourselves with family strife. We often talk about large-scale wars. Family conflict, however, is often more painful for each of its participants than news about war in Iraq or even in Israel, or events in Israel. Recalling everything I knew about ancient Russian history, I decided that, strange as it might seem at first glance, the only thread leading through the vast labyrinth of historical falsehoods was the conqueror Genghis Khan. In other words, the 300-year period of the so-called Tataro-Mongol yoke in Russia. Why? Because this period began shortly after the Christianization of Russia, when the traditions of our ancestors had not been completely annihilated. Not only that, but Genghis Khan was just about the brightest, most interesting, and enlightened personality of his time. It is not only that he and his descendants conquered half of the world, but it is fascinating to see how they did it. I can tell you right off that their army played only a secondary role in this process. We know from various historical sources that Genghis Khan sent expeditions to many lands, as far away as China and India, which supplied him with wise men. He spent a great deal of time conversing with men of wisdom. He was attempting to determine the purpose of human existence on the earth and to find immortality. In other words, he was gathering the wisdom of various peoples and could well have possessed information about the social structure of ancient Rus. And it turned out, in fact, that he did. I am convinced that it was thanks to this information that his family, his sons, and great-grandchildren were able to hold the so-called elite of many countries in subjection over the centuries. And I mean exactly that. It wasn't countries or their peoples that he held in subjection, but their elites that were usurping the peoples of these countries. Somebody might wonder what on earth the knowledge of the ancient family traditions and love-preserving rites has to do with the successful subjugation of states. You shouldn't be surprised. There is a simple, direct relationship, and such knowledge is more powerful than millions of soldiers' swords or even the most state-of-the-art weaponry. I shall not bother describing the whole 300-year period of the Tataro-Mongolian hold on Rus. I shall cite just one episode, albeit a very typical and interesting episode. The subjugation of the Vladimir Suzdal Principality, on which I have collected information from various sources. Let's try to arrive at some conclusions together. A mysterious maneuver. Chronicles, modern historical sources, and church literature all talk about a mysterious and even secretive maneuver on the part of Batu Khan, grandson to Genghis Khan, on the outskirts of the city of Vladimir in 1238. What is the mystery here? This is how the chronicles tell it. Having taken Ryasan in 1237, in the spring of 1238, Batu Khan and his cavalry pushed their way into the city of Suzdal. As subsequently reported in a multitude of ecclesiastical sources, he burnt Suzdal, exterminated part of the population, and took the remaining part captive. A lot is said in these sources about the atrocities committed against the people. Secular historians, on the other hand, describe the situation more accurately and impartially. Thus, for example, the materials available in the Vladimir Suzdal State Museum, the event is described as follows. The Tatars set up their camps at the city of Vladimir, while they themselves went and took Suzdal and plundered the Holy Mother of God cathedral, and burnt the prince's court, and burnt the monastery of Saint Dmitri, and plundered others, the old monks and nuns, and the priests, and the blind, and the lame, and the deaf, and the labor-weary, and all other people were slaughtered, while the young monks, and priests, and their wives, and the deacons with their wives, and their daughters, and their sons, all these were led away to the Tartars' camps, and they themselves went to Vladimir. As we can see, Batu Khan did not take anywhere near the whole population captive, and he killed off the old high-ranking monks and took the young ones captive. He didn't burn and plunder the whole city, but only the prince's residence along with Suzdal's churches and monasteries. And now let us try to solve a super-historical mystery. Why, as the document says, did the Tartars set up their camps at the city of Vladimir, while they themselves went and took Suzdal? Any military historian, as indeed any modern army commander, will tell you that this maneuver completely goes against standard military tactics. To establish a camp under the walls of a major fortified city and then leave it, and move one's troops to a smaller target, that is tantamount to suicide. The distance between the cities of Vladimir and Suzdal at the time was equivalent to 35 kilometers. With the roads rendered impassable by the spring rains, it was a good day's journey on horseback. The taking of Suzdal required a minimum of several more days, and then a day's journey back. It wouldn't have taken any more than a day for the soldiers defending Vladimir to go out of their fortified city on a foray and rout the defenseless enemy camp. All they had to do was seize the spare horses, the spare quivers of arrows, the supplies, the wall-storming ladders, and the stone-throwing devices, and they would have shorn the enemy not only of the possibility of launching an attack on them, but of their battle readiness in general. But they never went out. Why not? Perhaps they didn't know that Batu Khan's troops had left the camp. But they knew. They could have easily seen that from their battlements. Besides, their scouts would have reported it. Possibly, Batu Khan's forces were in such great numbers that more than enough guards had been left behind to repel an attack on the camp. This is the way historians initially explained it. They said the Golden Horde's troops numbered almost 1 million. They then changed their minds and reduced their estimate to 130,000, some even to as few as 30,000. Naturally, it is tempting to explain one's defeat by citing the enemy's significantly superior numbers. More objective scholars have begun to say that moving a 1,000,000-strong army at that time was an absolute impossibility. 1,000,000 swordsmen together with equipment would mean 3,000,000 horses. If a herd like that were kept in one place, even in the summertime they would die of hunger, since the grass all around would be trampled down, and in the wintertime no amount of feed supplies would be enough. So the figure was reduced to either 130,000 or 30,000, a humiliating figure indeed. With a scant 130,000 men, Batu Khan quietly went about conquering Russian principalities and whole countries too. But even this figure is inflated. To subjugate the Russian princes of that time using the knowledge left by Genghis Khan to his descendants, there was simply no need for even a 50,000-strong army. All that was required was knowledge of the way of life of the Russian people, Russian families, and the proper strategy based on such knowledge. After setting up camp at the city of Vladimir, Batu Khan did not go with a whole army of Suzdal, but sent a small detachment to take it. This is why the people of Vladimir did not leave their fortified city to rout the camp and destroy the enemy's military facilities. Do you know how many days and nights it took for Batu Khan's small detachment to conquer one of Rus's spiritual capitals of the time, surrounded as it was by more than half a dozen monastery fortresses? This legendary city of Suzdal? No time at all. He simply arrived, entered the city, and burnt the prince's residence. The prince, meanwhile, had fled together with his armed garrison. It was no effort to cut down every last one of the high-ranked clergy and take the young monks captive, and the Mongols later caught up with the prince and his garrison at the Sit River and destroyed them too. How could that be, someone may wonder? Where were the brave Russian people, their indomitable and freedom-loving spirit? I can tell you right off that there was nothing wrong with the Russian people and their spirit. Logic suggests that the people applauded Batu Khan's small detachment on its return journey from Suzdal. They served as kvass and braga to the warriors along the whole route back to their camp at Vladimir. The reason is that the people of that time did not look upon Suzdal as their city. Rather, they viewed its royal inhabitants as traitors and its clergy as foreign aggressors and enslavers. This led to the flare-up of a number of rebellions on part of the people against unbearable oppression. Documents at the Vladimir Suzdal State Museum put it this way. By the end of the 13th century, Suzdal had 8 monasteries. Founded by the princes and representatives of the Christian religion, they played a major role in assimilating new territories and served as fortresses in the event of enemy aggression. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the church owned a third of the best lands in the country and was endeavoring to subjugate the power of the grand princes to itself. From the end of the 15th century on, the state made repeated attempts to limit the land holdings of monasteries and churches, along with attempts at secularization, in other words, complete eradication. The question of land provoked 2 ideological tendencies within the church, Josephism and the non-possessors movement. The first defended the monastery's property interests, while the second emphasized the idea of inner self-perfection and condemned the monastery's acquisitive pursuits. The ideological leader of the Josephites was Father Joseph, abbot of the Volokolamsky monastery, while the non-possessors movement was championed by a monk of the Kirillo-Belosursky monastery, Nil Surovsky. The monastery and the clergy of Suzdal, as major landholders, came down solidly on the side of the Josephites. However, in the 16th century, the authority of the Grand Princes did not manage to carry out its intended secularization of the church's wealth and landholdings, which continued to increase, even though on a limited scale. Quite a trick. A third of the Russian lands ended up in the hands of the Constantinople-derived clergy and its puppets. Monasteries were transformed into large-scale slave owners, and it wasn't the monks who tilled the ground and raised cattle, but the peasant serfs. The princes were already trying to reclaim part of the country they had lost, but that was by no means easy. And just how was this enriching the souls of the peasants whose primordial family lands had now become monasterial property at one fell swoop? What was offered to people in exchange for their centuries-old traditions and rites, which were now labeled barbarian? The same archival documents show what happened here. Fees and penalties imposed on the peasant serfs of the Pokrovsky nunnery in 1653. From each household, 2 altiens, a chicken and a lamb's wool from the first shearing. On the purchase of a horse, 2 dengas, a cow, 1 denga. On the sale of grains, horses, cows, hay, 1 altin for each ruble received. Log houses, 1 denga per internal corner. For settling disputes regarding field lands, 2 altins, 2 dengas. Regarding household lands, 2 altins, 2 dengas. Court fees for travel to the site of a dispute, 1 denga per verst. For travel in cases of acquittal, 2 dengas per verst. From the guilty party, 1 altin for each ruble assessed. For the vindicated party, 7 altins, 2 dengas. For taking an oath, 4 altins, 2 dengas. Wedding fees from the groom, 3 altins, 3 dengas. From the bride for a table, 2 altins, 2 dengas. From a groom from outside the district, 2 grivnas. From holiday beer making, for weddings or funerals, 1 bucket of beer. Penalties for alcohol distillation for oneself without a permit, or for sale, 5 rubles, a beating with a cane, and arrest. For consumption of wine except on holidays, 8 altiens, 2 dengas, and a beating with a cane. And here is a description of the property of the highest-ranked church officials. List of people and property belonging to Metropolitan Ilarion. 16 elders, 6 overseers in charge of properties, 66 personal bodyguards, 23 servants, 25 singers, 2 sextons, 13 bell ringers, 59 craftsmen and laborers, in total 180 persons. Weaponry numbering 93 pieces, silver dishes weighing 1 pood, 20 pounds, pewter dishes weighing more than 16 poods, 112 horses belonging to the Metropolitan's horse farm, 5 carriages, 8 sleighs and chariots, 147 books. From the inventory of the Metropolitan's household, 1701. A most extraordinary document. It is free of any kind of historical inaccuracies. It simply provides an impartial inventory of the Metropolitan's household property. However, it also begs a great many questions. What kind of properties did the Metropolitan have that required the services of 6 overseers? Why a whole 23 servants for 1 man? And were the 93 pieces of weaponry also intended for the conducting of church rites? Note that none of this was the monastery's property. It was just the Metropolitan's personal effects. The monastery had its own. Just who was such a large contingent of guards supposed to protect the Metropolitan from? He had more bodyguards than the first American presidents. The large contingent of guards, like the high monastery walls, were designed to protect the Metropolitan from the Russian people. Of course, the walls of the Sudzal monasteries had no strategic significance in terms of military policy. But why, then, do almost all historical sources describe the high monastery walls with their embrasures and fortresses designed to protect the people from the enemy? Why were there not these so-called fortresses capable of holding out for at least a month? because they weren't at all designed for defense against any external aggressor, let alone a smart one. For the soldiers under Genghis Khan's grandson, in any case, such fortifications were no more than a distraction. If the possessors of these mock fortresses had not acceded to the enemy's demand for immediate surrender, the Mongols would have thrown up an embankment a little higher than the walls and dragged their stone-throwing devices up onto it. There are many possible scenarios here. One of them involved putting a bag into the stone launcher attached to a long rope and launching the bag over the monastery wall. Before it hit the ground, the bag would become undone, showering the people hiding behind the wall with infected meat. After that, all they had to do was shoot the people as they attempted to escape through the main entrance gate. The only thing that the high monastery wall served as a protection against was their own people, the peasant serfs, or rather, the monastery slaves, who from time to time rebelled. It was none other than the Constantinople clergy who applied their lofty spirituality to the inculcation of serf law in Rus. One document from the Suzdal Museum archives attests to the following. Church landholdings prevailed in Suzdal in the 17th century as they had before. Monasteries and the metropolitan's residents were major feudal landlords, with enormous financial resources at their command, not to mention the free labor of many thousands of peasants. Thus, the Spaso-Yefimiev monastery placed fifth among all Russia's church-based feudal lords. Its prosperity depended wholly upon land grants and contributions. In the second half of the 17th century, the earlier established fiefdoms did not increase in size, as the inordinate expansion of monastery lands was held in check by the state. The peasants were subject to a double exploitation, first by the landowners, the corvée and tribute system, and secondly by the state, taxes payable in both money and kind. Or, take this quote from a similar document on the history of the Sviato-Pokrovsky nunnery. The full and free life enjoyed by the nuns was made possible by the labors of peasant serfs and the enormous staff of servants. The landholdings of the Pokrovsky nunnery grew, thanks to rich donations and grants on part of the Russians' most elite families, including princes and tsars. So there we have it. More lands, more serfs, and more wealth. But let us return to the 13th century. What then actually happened with the arrival of Batu Khan's detachment at Suzdal? And where do traditions and love enter the picture? The population of Suzdal at that time was fewer than 4,000 inhabitants. It consisted mainly of the prince's armed garrison and servants, craftsmen and clergy with their host of unpaid servants, hiding from people behind the monastery walls. All around Suzdal and Vladimir lived tens of thousands of peasant families who were the only ones capable of worthily resisting an aggressor. But they didn't do this. They didn't rise up in arms. They didn't go to the monastery walls to protect the clergy. To put it simply, they hated the clergy. Note that they didn't hate God, only their oppressors. The people loved and revered God. It was for this reason that the people didn't rise to the defense of the city of Vladimir. Batu Khan waited 6 days before storming Vladimir. He waited until the news spread that it wasn't the people he was taking captive, but their enslavers. He waited and took the well-fortified city in a single day. It was to this end that he made the foray against Suzdal. The foray was of no military importance, but it served to deprive the authorities of support from the populace at large. And then, what did the Mongols do? Realizing that they could find no better overseers and tax collectors than the princes in collaboration with the clergy, they began to issue the princes licenses to govern and the right to collect taxes from the Russian people, a portion of which was to be handed over to the horde. Many monasteries were exempted from taxation. All of this is confirmed by the specific documents. Just so people don't go pointing the finger at me or the scientists or secular historians, let us turn directly to literature from the church itself. There is a fairly decent historical book published by the Sviato-Pokrovsky Nunnery, with the blessings of Evlogi, Archbishop of Vladimir and Suzdal, which states, Saint Fyodor, the first bishop of Suzdal, was from a Greek family. He arrived in Rus in 987, in the entourage accompanying the Saint Michael from Constantinople. Saint Michael baptized Grand Prince Vladimir at Korsun, and subsequently became the first metropolitan of Kiev. After the baptism of the Kievian in 988, the prince, who had been accorded apostolic status, traveled around the Russian cities together with his sons and Saint Michael on a zealous proselytizing campaign. Bishoprics were established in Chernigov, Belgorod, Pereyaslav, Novgorod, and Vladimir Volosnik. As can be seen from these reports, as well as from other sources, foreign ideologists were descending upon Rus in mass. Complete with hired bodyguards and the prince's own contingent, they began to travel around the Russian cities, breaking down foundations that had been in place for millennia, planting an ideology profitable to the church and government of the day, and establishing foreigners in charge of cities. Many historical documents testify to how the people resisted, though it appears they were poorly organized and they did not expect treason on the part of their own prince. It was this treason that was largely responsible for the massive foreign invasions that befell Rus. The saddest part was that it was done in the name of God. What an incredible sacrilege! What if Prince Vladimir and the bishops from Constantinople actually believed sincerely in Christ's commandments? But subsequent events shows that their real masters were the exact opposite of God. They were the servants of this opposite, with the advanced ability to manipulate the people, to subjugate to themselves their spirit and their will. They suggested to man, "You are God's slave," actually meaning, "You are my slave." And man began to forget that God has not and cannot have slaves. Man is the son of God, his beloved son. All the quotations reproduced in this book are taken from historical documents. I gained access to them not by going to some super secret archives, but simply by paying 15 rubles to get into the State Museum and 30 rubles for the right to take pictures. I photographed the displays set up for general viewing. One of them was entitled Monasteries as Ecclesiastical Feudal Landlords. And that is by no means the only official state source. There are many of them. One that exerts an immeasurably greater influence, for example, especially on the young, is a grade 10 high school textbook published by Prosevcheny in 2003 and recommended by the Ministry of Education of the Russian Federation. This is a high-quality publication under the editorship of A. N. Sakharov and V. I. Buganov. On page 63, it says, "Along with this, the Church persecuted the old folk pagan culture and came out against the Roman model of Christianity, calling it Latinism and apostasy. This damaged Rus's relations with countries confessing the Catholic faith and contributed to Rus's isolation from Western European culture. Church facilities began to introduce slave labor. Some clerics and monasteries engaged in usury and victimized people. There were cases where prominent politicians active in the church took part in political machinations. Thus, there frequently arose a discrepancy between the words of the church and its deeds, and this provoked a feeling of discontent among the people. The textbook also mentions that Prince Vladimir, who baptized Rus in 987, was the son of Sviatoslav by a slave of his mother's named Malusha. Consequently, he was accorded a secondary ranking among the prince's sons. It further states, Vladimir spent more than 2 years in foreign parts, and when he was approaching Novgorod, he had with him a strong Varangian contingent. He quickly took control of Novgorod and began preparing for his trek south. Along the way, Vladimir conquered Polotsk, where he killed the reigning Varangian prince Rogvolod and his sons, raping Rogvolod's daughter Rognela and forcibly taking her to wife. The textbook goes on to describe how the Kievan prince Yaropolk, Vladimir's brother, came to negotiate with him. No sooner had he entered the hall than Vladimir's bodyguards ran their swords through him. We also read an account of the baptism and the imposition of the sacramental obligation to pay the church 10% of the tribute collected from the people. It should be remembered that at that time the church was in subjugation to the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Russia still did not have its own patriarch, which means that 10% of the tribute money collected from the Russian people was at the disposal of Constantinople. Might it not be in historical facts like these that we uncover an answer to the question as to why the people didn't rise to the church's defense when Peter the Great closed a third of the Russian monasteries and melted down church bells to produce cannon? Or when Catherine the Great went about secularizing, i.e. confiscating monastery land holdings, which meant that formerly wealthy monks were obliged to beg for food and live at the mercy of the Tsar, or when the Bolsheviks started killing clerics and blowing up churches, why some of the people themselves participated in the plunder of the church property. My remarks on the subject of the church are based on historical facts and documents. I have resolved to call upon sensibly minded members of the church hierarchy and its wise elders, who I am sure are out there, to transform the modern church into a highly spiritual institution, one capable of helping society escape from its economic and spiritual crisis. Love and the state's military preparedness. But what link can there possibly be, readers who might wonder, between the conquest of Russia and love? The connection is quite direct. After seizing Russian lands, enslaving the Russian peasants, prohibiting rites capable of leading to love, the Constantinople assault force thereby began to hinder the formation of strong, loving families, and especially family domains. This meant, in effect, the immediate imposition of serf law. Love among slaves, as a rule, is a most unhappy love. In order for the feeling of love ignited in young people to be preserved, one's own space is required. If it is not there, love, as a rule, vanishes. And what space could be possessed by slaves? None at all. Let's think. Why, over the many millennia before the princes came to Russia, was our territory never conquered? There was the Egyptian army, after all, and the Roman legions, but all these hosts, with all their well-trained and well-equipped soldiers, did not succeed in conquering our lands. To answer this question, let us suppose that Genghis Khan's troops had launched an invasion of pre-Christian Rus. At that time, the territory of our present-day country was inhabited almost exclusively by the people living in family communities. At the approach of any army, no matter what its size, the members of the community would hide part of their food supplies, take the remainder with them, along with their household livestock, and head off into the forest. Their horses and cows were loaded up with family belongings. An invading army could move into a territory only so far as the provisions they carried with them allowed. But this was already an army on its last legs. The return journey would be impossible. They couldn't go hunting in the forest, as that had to be done in small groups. Any larger groupings would scare away the game. But once they penetrated the forest, small groups would quickly fall into the traps and perish. They ate, for the most part, the meat of their own emaciated horses, whose numbers kept rapidly decreasing, so that any kind of movement became exceedingly difficult. Our ancestors would set up a whole bunch of clever traps all along the route of the foe's retreat, both in the forests and on the rivers. For example, they would sink a huge tree with prickly branches and stretch a cable tied to the tree across the water and fasten its other end on the shore. Whenever a boat approached the spot, the tree would float to the surface and catch to the side of the boat in its branches, and then sink again, overturning the boat in the process. In the meantime, the retreating soldiers would be met with the hail of arrows and harpoons launched from the shore. But when the retreating soldiers stepped out on the bank after gathering together the rest of the troops that had been spread out along the flotilla, there was nobody to be seen. The people annihilated any enemy that invaded their motherland. After all, they had something worth protecting. This was no abstract motherland defined only by a beautiful word with not even a clump of native soil to back it up. They had their own family land, the same land that their ancestors had called home. And now it was where they lived along with their families, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And there was love in their families, and they protected their dear mothers, fathers, and children. They protected their love, and that was why they could not be conquered.